What we love will ruin us. This prophetic observation captures the essence of a debate that has raged among social critics for decades. Are we sleepwalking into tyranny through the brutal force of authoritarian control, or are we dancing willingly into servitude through the seductive embrace of pleasure and convenience? Two literary giants of the 20th century offered starkly different visions of how freedom might be lost. One imagined a world where truth is destroyed through violence and fear, where reality itself becomes malleable under the weight of state power. The other envisioned a society where truth becomes irrelevant amid an ocean of trivial pleasures, where citizens surrender their autonomy not to escape pain, but to maximize comfort. The question confronting us today is not merely which vision proves more accurate, but whether we are witnessing the simultaneous realization of both dystopian futures, creating a hybrid form of control more sophisticated and insidious than either writer imagined alone. The first vision emerged from a mind intimately familiar with the machinery of totalitarian oppression. Having witnessed the rise of fascism and communism, having observed how ideological movements could transform ordinary citizens into instruments of state terror, this observer understood that power's ultimate goal is not merely obedience, but the complete reconstruction of human consciousness itself. In this dystopia, control is maintained through constant surveillance, historical revisionism, and the systematic destruction of language and independent thought. Citizens live in perpetual fear of punishment for crimes they may not even realize they have committed. The state maintains power by creating external enemies, orchestrating endless wars, and demanding absolute loyalty to shifting political narratives. Truth becomes whatever those in power declare it to be, and the capacity for independent reasoning gradually atrophies under the weight of relentless propaganda and surveillance. The second vision originated from a different understanding of human nature and social control. Rather than focusing on fear and coercion, this perspective recognized that human beings could be more effectively controlled through the manipulation of their desires, rather than their fears. In this dystopia, citizens are not oppressed but entertained into submission. They are provided with endless streams of pleasure, comfort, and distraction that make the very concept of freedom seem irrelevant. There are no forbidden books because no one wants to read them. There is no need to suppress dissent, because critical thinking itself has been rendered obsolete by the overwhelming availability of immediate gratification. The state maintains control not through violence, but through the careful management of pleasure, and the elimination of any discomfort that might prompt deeper reflection or questioning. Both visions share certain fundamental insights about the nature of power and human psychology. They recognize that effective control requires more than mere physical domination. It demands the conquest of consciousness itself. They understand that language and information are crucial battlegrounds in the struggle between freedom and tyranny. They perceive that social isolation and the destruction of genuine human relationships are essential tools for maintaining authoritarian control. Most importantly, both recognize that the greatest threat to freedom comes not from external enemies, but from the gradual erosion of the human capacity for independent thought, moral reasoning, and collective resistance. However, the mechanisms through which these erosions occur differ dramatically between the two visions. The first relies on negative reinforcement. Punishment, fear, and deprivation create compliance through the desire to avoid suffering. Citizens conform because deviation brings terrible consequences. The second employs positive reinforcement. Pleasure, comfort, and constant stimulation create compliance through the desire to maximize enjoyment. Citizens conform because deviation would mean giving up the satisfactions that have become central to their identity and sense of well-being. The first vision assumes that humans have an inherent desire for truth and freedom that must be actively suppressed through external force. The second assumes that these desires are weak and easily overwhelmed by more immediate biological and psychological drives. Contemporary society exhibits elements of both dystopian visions, creating a form of control that is more nuanced and potentially more effective than either pure model. We see surveillance technologies that would have amazed the totalitarian states of the 20th century, yet much of this surveillance is voluntary, even enthusiastic. Citizens carry tracking devices, share intimate details of their lives on public platforms, and submit to behavioral monitoring in exchange for convenience and entertainment. We witness the systematic distortion of information and the erosion of shared standards for truth, yet much of this distortion occurs not through centralized propaganda, but through the fragmentation of information sources and the algorithms that feed us increasingly personalized versions of reality. We observe the decline of civic engagement and political participation. Yet this decline appears driven more by apathy and distraction than by fear and repression. The contemporary information environment exemplifies this hybrid approach to social control. Traditional gatekeepers of information have lost their monopoly, but rather than leading to greater freedom and truth-seeking, this democratization has often produced confusion and fragmentation. Citizens can access virtually unlimited information, yet many seem less informed and more susceptible to manipulation than previous generations. The problem is not the suppression of information, but its superabundance. Not censorship, but the inability to distinguish reliable from unreliable sources amid the constant flood of data. Algorithms designed to maximize engagement rather than truth have created echo chambers that reinforce existing beliefs while exposing users to increasingly extreme and polarizing content. This represents a synthesis of both dystopian visions. Information is both controlled and abundant, both restricted and overwhelming. Economic systems in developed nations further illustrate this hybrid model of control. Citizens enjoy unprecedented material prosperity and consumer choice, yet these benefits often come at the cost of economic security, meaningful work, and genuine autonomy. The gig economy promises freedom and flexibility, while creating new forms of precarity and dependence. Consumer debt provides immediate gratification, while creating long-term obligations that constrain future choices. The welfare state offers protection from the harshest forms of poverty, while creating bureaucratic dependencies that can be difficult to escape. Work becomes increasingly automated and specialized, reducing many jobs to repetitive tasks that offer little opportunity for creativity or intellectual development. Yet these conditions are packaged and marketed as progress, efficiency, and liberation from traditional constraints. Educational institutions demonstrate another facet of this synthesis. Schools increasingly resemble both the conformity-producing factories described in the first dystopian vision and the pleasure-maximizing entertainment centers imagined in the second. Standardized testing and curriculum create uniformity and discourage critical thinking, while educational technologies promise to make learning fun and effortless. Students are surveilled through digital platforms that track their every click and keystroke, yet this monitoring is presented as personalized learning and academic support. The capacity for sustained attention and deep thought atrophies under the constant stimulation of digital media, while grades and credentials become more important than actual knowledge or understanding. Critical thinking skills decline not because they are forbidden, but because they are rendered unnecessary by systems that provide pre-packaged answers and discourage questioning. The realm of politics and governance reveals perhaps the most sophisticated fusion of both dystopian models. Democratic institutions persist in form, while increasingly failing to provide genuine representation or accountability. Citizens retain the right to vote and speak freely, yet these rights often feel hollow when exercised within systems that seem impervious to popular influence. Political discourse becomes increasingly polarized and superficial, focusing on personality conflicts and tribal loyalties rather than substantive policy debates. The media landscape fragments into partisan echo chambers that reinforce existing beliefs rather than challenging assumptions, or providing shared facts for democratic deliberation. Government surveillance capabilities expand dramatically, yet much of this expansion occurs with minimal public resistance, because it is justified through appeals to security and convenience, rather than explicit authoritarian ideology. The result is a system that maintains the appearance of democratic governance, while operating through mechanisms that would have been familiar to the architects of 20th-century totalitarianism. Citizens are neither terrorized into submission nor drugged into compliance, but rather managed through a complex combination of distraction, fragmentation, and the illusion of choice. They can vote for different candidates who often implement remarkably similar policies, shop among numerous brands that are often owned by the same corporations, and choose from countless entertainment options that deliver fundamentally similar content. The appearance of diversity and freedom masks an underlying standardization and control that operates through market mechanisms, rather than state coercion. Technology companies have emerged as perhaps the most powerful agents of this hybrid control system. They provide services that genuinely improve many aspects of daily life, while simultaneously collecting unprecedented amounts of personal data and shaping behavior through sophisticated psychological manipulation. Social media platforms connect people across vast distances, while often leaving them feeling more isolated and anxious than before. Search engines provide access to human knowledge, while simultaneously filtering and prioritizing information in ways that users rarely understand. Artificial intelligence systems promise to solve complex problems, while potentially reducing human agency and decision-making capacity. These technologies are neither purely liberating nor purely oppressive, but represent a new form of power that operates through seduction, rather than coercion, through engagement rather than fear. The psychological impact of this hybrid system may be more profound than either pure dystopian vision anticipated. Citizens experience a form of learned helplessness that stems not from punishment, but from the overwhelming complexity of modern life and the constant availability of easy distractions from difficult problems. They develop what might be called informed apathy, an awareness that serious problems exist, combined with a sense that individual action is futile and systemic change impossible. This psychological state is maintained not through the suppression of information, but through its constant proliferation, not through the elimination of choice, but through its multiplication, beyond the point of meaningful decision-making. The result is a population that is neither ignorant nor enlightened, neither oppressed nor free, but suspended in a state of managed confusion that serves the interests of those who benefit from the status quo. Social relationships in this environment become increasingly mediated by technological systems and market mechanisms. Genuine human connection becomes more difficult to achieve and maintain when most interactions occur through digital platforms designed to maximize engagement and data collection, rather than authentic communication. Traditional sources of meaning and identity, family, community, religion, craft, weaken under the pressure of mobility, individualism, and consumer culture, yet the alternatives offered by modern society often prove shallow and unsatisfying. Citizens are encouraged to construct their identities through consumption choices and online personas, rather than through meaningful relationships and productive activities. This creates a form of social atomization that serves the interests of both authoritarian control and consumer manipulation, leaving individuals more vulnerable to both political and commercial influence, while feeling increasingly disconnected from sources of genuine support and meaning. The question of resistance becomes more complex in this hybrid environment than either dystopian vision anticipated. Traditional forms of opposition, political organizing, protest movements, alternative media, continue to exist, but often feel inadequate to the scale and sophistication of contemporary control mechanisms. Moreover, the system's flexibility and responsiveness allow it to incorporate and neutralize many forms of resistance, by turning them into consumer choices or entertainment spectacles. Dissent becomes another product to be packaged and sold, rebellion becomes another lifestyle option, and criticism becomes another form of engagement that feeds the very systems it purports to oppose. Yet this analysis should not lead to despair or fatalistic acceptance. Understanding the nature of contemporary control systems is the first step toward developing more effective responses. The hybrid model's sophistication is also its potential weakness. It requires the active participation and consent of those it controls, making it vulnerable to collective withdrawal of cooperation in ways that purely coercive systems are not. The very technologies that enable new forms of control also create new possibilities for organization, communication, and resistance. The abundance of information that can overwhelm and confuse can also educate and enlighten, when approached with proper critical thinking skills and intellectual discipline. The key insight for contemporary resistance movements may be recognizing that the battle is fought simultaneously on multiple fronts: technological, economic, cultural, and psychological, and requires strategies that address all of these dimensions, rather than focusing on any single aspect of the system. The path toward greater freedom and authentic human flourishing in this context requires what we might call conscious resistance, a deliberate and informed choice to resist both the coercive and seductive aspects of contemporary control systems. This resistance must be simultaneously individual and collective, technological and humanistic, critical and constructive. On the individual level, conscious resistance involves developing what the ancient philosophers called practical wisdom, the ability to discern between genuine goods and false satisfactions, between meaningful challenges and pointless distractions, between authentic relationships and manipulative simulations. This requires cultivating attention and focus in an environment designed to scatter and fragment consciousness. It means learning to question not only official narratives but also our own desires and assumptions, recognizing how thoroughly our preferences and beliefs may have been shaped by forces we do not fully understand. It involves developing tolerance for discomfort, uncertainty, and complexity, rather than constantly seeking the easy answers and immediate gratifications that make us more susceptible to manipulation. Most importantly, it requires building genuine relationships and communities that can provide alternative sources of meaning, support, and identity to those offered by consumer culture and digital platforms. The practice of conscious resistance might involve deliberate acts of disconnection from systems of surveillance and manipulation, choosing privacy over convenience, depth over breadth, quality over quantity in our information consumption and social interactions. It might mean learning skills that reduce dependence on complex technological and economic systems, growing food, making things with our hands, developing local relationships and knowledge that cannot be easily monitored or commodified. It certainly involves cultivating the capacity for sustained attention and deep thought that enables us to see through the superficial narratives and distractions that surround us. This is not a call for wholesale rejection of modernity or technology, but rather for a more conscious and selective engagement with the tools and systems that shape our lives. On the collective level, conscious resistance requires building institutions and communities that embody different values and operate according to different principles than those that dominate mainstream society. This might involve creating alternative economic arrangements that prioritize human flourishing over profit maximization, worker cooperatives, local currencies, gift economies, and mutual aid networks. It might mean developing educational approaches that cultivate critical thinking, creativity, and wisdom, rather than mere compliance and information processing. It certainly involves creating media and cultural institutions that serve the cause of truth and human development, rather than engagement and profit. These alternative institutions need not be perfect or complete to be valuable. Their primary function is to demonstrate that other ways of organizing human activity are possible, and to provide spaces where individuals can experience and practice different forms of social organization. The technological dimension of conscious resistance involves both critical analysis and creative innovation. We need better understanding of how digital technologies affect human psychology and social organization, including their potential for both liberation and control. This requires technical literacy that enables individuals to understand and influence the systems they use, rather than simply consuming them passively. It also requires the development of alternative technologies that prioritize human agency and flourishing over efficiency and profit. Tools that enhance rather than replace human capabilities, that promote genuine connection rather than addictive engagement, that preserve privacy and autonomy rather than extracting data and attention. The open source movement provides one model for how technology can be developed according to different principles. But much more innovation is needed to create viable alternatives to the extractive and manipulative systems that currently dominate the digital landscape. Cultural resistance involves the creation and preservation of art, literature, and ideas that maintain alternative visions of human possibility and social organization. This includes both critique of existing systems and positive exploration of different ways of living and thinking. It requires institutions, schools, libraries, theaters, galleries, community centers, that can serve as spaces for genuine intellectual and artistic exploration, rather than mere entertainment or propaganda. It also requires individuals who are willing to engage seriously with difficult ideas and challenging art, rather than consuming only what is comfortable and familiar. The role of culture in resistance is not merely to provide distraction from political and economic problems, but to expand our imagination of what human life could become, and to preserve the knowledge and wisdom that make genuine alternatives possible. Educational resistance focuses on developing human capacities that make individuals less susceptible to manipulation and more capable of independent thought and action. This goes beyond formal schooling to include all the ways that people learn and develop throughout their lives. It involves teaching not just information but wisdom, the ability to distinguish between truth and falsehood, between meaningful and trivial pursuits, between authentic and manipulative relationships. It requires developing emotional and social intelligence alongside technical and analytical skills, cultivating the capacity for empathy and cooperation alongside critical thinking and independence. Most importantly, it involves helping individuals understand their own psychology and social conditioning well enough to make genuinely free choices, rather than simply following programmed responses to external stimuli. The economic dimension of conscious resistance involves creating forms of production and exchange that serve human needs rather than abstract market forces. This might include supporting local businesses and community-based economics over global corporations, choosing quality and durability over quantity and disposability, prioritizing meaningful work over mere income maximization. It also involves understanding how economic systems shape social relationships and individual psychology, and working to create economic arrangements that support rather than undermine human flourishing and ecological sustainability. This does not necessarily require rejection of all market mechanisms or technological innovation, but rather their subordination to human and ecological values rather than their elevation as ends in themselves. Political resistance in this context involves not just supporting particular candidates or policies, but working to create more genuine forms of democratic participation and accountability. This might include developing local and regional institutions that allow for more direct citizen involvement in decision-making, creating alternative media systems that provide better information for democratic deliberation, and building coalitions that can effectively challenge concentrated economic and political power. It also involves understanding how contemporary political systems actually operate, rather than how they are supposed to operate according to textbook descriptions, and developing strategies that are adequate to the real mechanisms of power, rather than the idealized versions we are taught to believe in. Perhaps most fundamentally, conscious resistance requires what we might call spiritual or philosophical resistance. The cultivation of inner qualities and perspectives that make individuals less susceptible to external manipulation and more capable of authentic self-direction. This involves developing a clear sense of values and purpose that cannot be easily swayed by changing fashions or external pressures, cultivating the capacity for solitude and reflection that enables genuine self-knowledge, and maintaining connection to sources of meaning and value that transcend immediate personal interests. Different people will find these sources in different places: religious traditions, philosophical systems, artistic practices, natural environments, or human relationships. But the common element is a grounding in something deeper and more enduring than the constant flux of contemporary culture. The ultimate goal of conscious resistance is not merely to oppose existing systems, but to create the conditions for genuine human flourishing. Societies that support the development of wisdom, compassion, creativity, and authentic freedom, rather than mere efficiency, entertainment, and control. This is necessarily a long-term project that will require sustained effort from many people working in many different ways. It offers no easy solutions or quick fixes, but rather a path of ongoing development and engagement that can provide meaning and purpose even in difficult circumstances. The choice between dystopian futures may ultimately be less important than the choice to actively participate in creating alternatives that transcend both visions of human diminishment and point toward possibilities that neither author fully imagined.